Hello and welcome to the Met Office 10-day trend. The next 10 days take us to Christmas and beyond. And like most people's Christmases, there's always a bit of uncertainty. Things can get complicated. But let's break it down because the run-up to Christmas is fairly straightforward in that it means more unsettled weather. There'll be further spells of rain over the next few days. Often it'll be quite windy as well. Reasonably mild, particularly through the weekend. If you're after a dry day, if you're travelling, then Saturday at this stage looks like a reasonable bet. It's after the weekend, as we head straight into Christmas Eve and Christmas Day, that things do get complicated and the level of uncertainty in the forecast increases, particularly with detail. But what we can say at this stage is that, well, sorry to disappoint white Christmas fans, but snow looks unlikely, as does severe weather. Now, when I'm talking about severe weather here, I'm talking about strong winds, violent winds and heavy rain. There could be some issues with mist and fog in particular. That is likely to be, if you're travelling, the biggest hazard. But at the moment, wet and windy weather, certainly extreme wet and windy weather, also looks unlikely. Beyond that, high pressure looks like moving in. So the period beyond Christmas towards New Year looks an awful lot drier, an increased chance of frosts and fog patches as well. And we are going to take a bit of a peek even beyond 10 days and have a look at something in January. And yes, it will get a bit colder in January, but here I'm talking about the potential for things to get colder than average. More on that in a moment. First of all, let's get through the next few days because, as I said, they look generally mild and unsettled. Low pressure in charge. This one's bringing lots of showers through Wednesday and Thursday. Then more low pressure systems join in. These weather fronts bring a wet night on Thursday night. Just going to pause it there because this little feature here could well bring some very wet and very windy weather for a time on Friday evening to South Wales and southwest England. So we need to watch that quite closely. It should scoot through on Friday night. And then there's more low pressures, more weather fronts waiting to bring more wet and windy weather. But there's also just a little ridge, a tiny little bump there in the isobars, which means that for many, Saturday it looks dry, certainly a lot drier than last Saturday. However, it doesn't last long. The weather fronts then join in, bring potentially more wet weather and possibly windy weather on Sunday. So why is it wet and windy for the next few days? Well, let's take a look at what's going on high up in the atmosphere. It's put the jet stream on, that fast-moving ribbon of air, and it's, well, driving these low-pressure systems across the country through the weekend. But then things get complicated. And why? Well, let's take a look at the big picture because the jet stream isn't just flowing in a straight line across the Atlantic like it often does. It's getting pretty mixed up. By the time we get to Christmas Eve, it's driving south, then to the north, and then driving south and back north again. And when this kind of pattern happens, well, uncertainty in the forecast is increased. And the computer models are just having trouble handling how the jet stream is eventually going to sort itself out. Now, it does look as if high pressure will build in beyond Christmas, but how it gets across the UK, well, that's why there's uncertainty through Christmas Eve and particularly on Christmas Day itself. I'm going to show you a couple of scenarios now, and it's all dependent on how the jet stream interacts and breaks down as to how we get the picture for Christmas Day. Now, high pressure looks like moving in. This scenario has the high pressure building up from the south, and that means winds coming up from the south, which means it's quite mild. And that's why we've got the yellow and the green colours, a lot of spots across the UK. That's light rain and drizzle. So if this scenario is right, your Christmas Day walk is likely to be grey, damp and drizzly, but mild. Temperatures way too high to see any snow. The other scenario, depending on what happens with the jet stream, is that high pressure builds in, but builds in from the north. And so you can see here the colours, much colder air across the UK on Christmas Day, but with high pressure over us, not much falling out of the sky. So largely dry, and your Christmas Day walk is much more likely to be like this, bright, but with a frost on the ground in the morning. So those two scenarios at the moment, yes, at this stage, we're just too unsure, and it's because of those complications with the jet stream. Now, somewhat counterintuitively, beyond Christmas, confidence in the forecast grows again, and it looks like high pressure will move in and then dominate for much of the period between Christmas and New Year. That means that a lot of dry weather is in the forecast. Again, good news if you're travelling through that period, but the potential for some problems for driving with fog patches, particularly over higher ground. So that's the scenario for days 7 to 10, if you like. And as I said, counterintuitively, we're much more confident in that than we are on Christmas Day itself. Now, this is the last 10-day trend of the year, and we're in a position to actually give a slightly longer forecast into the start of 2019. I'm going to talk a little bit now about sudden stratospheric warming. If you watched the Weather Studio live last week, we had Jeff Knight, an expert, talking about sudden stratospheric warming, and now it looks as if there is a pretty high chance that SSW, sudden stratospheric warming, is going to happen towards the end of this year. Now, sudden stratospheric warming is where the temperature suddenly rises high up in the atmosphere, 30 or 50 kilometers above the North Pole. This is what happened earlier this year, and what fed into a chain reaction, which then led into us experiencing very cold conditions from the east, and then we got a lot of snowfall, of course. Now, the two things are linked, but they don't always lead that chain of reaction. So there's a high chance of SSW happening. That just increases as we go into January. There's normally a couple of week lag. There's an increased likelihood of colder than average weather in January, and that does also raise the increased chances of snow. Now, it's just a chance at this stage. High chance that SSW will happen, and then the knock-on effects for that. There's the possibility that it could turn colder in January. This is a long way off. We will, of course, continue to keep you updated both in the long range and in the short range. If you're traveling over the Christmas period, make sure you stay up to date with the latest from the Met Office.